What's up guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Dalton. I am a travel and lifestyle photographer, and I teach people like you how to become the best photographer that you can be. So today we're gonna talk about how you can get super sharp, tack sharp photos with every photo that you take. I remember when I first started out as a photographer, people were telling me to shoot in manual mode, and I thought that they were also talking about manual focus, and I was super confused by that, and I was confused with all the settings and blah, 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 blah. Stop, calm down. This stuff actually doesn't need to be complicated. It's actually really simple. It's so simple, in fact, that after you watch this video, I promise you, you will never, ever take a blurry photo again. Before we jump into the content, guys, I just want to remind you I'm giving away a free orange and teal preset pack, a full pack, 6 presets. Link is in the description. You guys can check that out, download those presets and use them on your mobile phone, on your desktop, laptop, tablet, wherever. Those are for you guys to enjoy. But now let's jump into the content. Starting off with point number 1, and that is to always use autofocus. In fact, manual focus, throw it out the window. 99% of the time, you're not gonna be using manual focus simply because it isn't practical. As weird as it sounds, cameras see things in a way that we don't, and they can see things almost better than us. They can see contrast better, they can see lines better, and cameras detect all those lines and contrast and everything going on in the image, and they will choose your focus in a way that's super effective and often very accurate. Only in certain situations are we ever gonna be using manual mode. And that might be if you're shooting in difficult lighting environments. Say for example, there's a subject that's backlit and the camera's just having a really hard time finding that subject. You might use manual focus in that situation. If you're shooting astrophotography, you're gonna wanna use manual focus because it's hard to get those stars in focus. And then maybe if you're shooting like macro photography, or for me, when I used to shoot coffee and food, I would use manual focus because when you get so close to a subject, you need to make sure it's exactly right on point. That's when you would use manual focus. But any other situation, you're not gonna be using manual focus because it just isn't practical. Now, in terms of autofocus modes, most of the time you guys can just use single shot autofocus or one shot autofocus. It's the same thing depending on your camera manufacturer. That's gonna be the best. And that's basically where you half press the shutter button, it beeps twice, and then it locks your focus. And then you can move the camera, reframe, and take your shot. That's the easiest focus mode to use, and that's the one that I'm using a lot. If you're shooting moving subjects, then you might want to use continuous autofocus. That's also called continuous servo autofocus, depending on your camera manufacturer. And that autofocus mode is essentially where the camera just keeps changing focus depending on what's happening in the frame. So it's not gonna lock the focus, it's just gonna keep adjusting it. So right now I'm using continuous AF, and if I hold my hand up in front of the frame, it's gonna focus on my hand. And then if I move away, it's gonna focus on the background. My focus point is in the middle, it's right on me, so it's just gonna focus on whatever is in this area. And that leads me on to point number 2, which is slam that like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Just kidding guys, that's not point number 2. But if you're new here, please consider doing that. It really helps out the channel, and I promise you're gonna be getting plenty of content that's gonna help you out as a photographer. So the real point number 2 is to use single point autofocus. So when we're shooting, we need to be telling our cameras exactly where we want it to focus. And if we use a small single point, then that camera will know exactly where we're focusing. If we're using one of those modes like wide autofocus or zone autofocus, it's just gonna kind of look throughout the whole frame and find something to focus on. But we don't want that. Oftentimes the camera's gonna focus on something that we just don't really want to be in focus. But if we use a single point, we can be very direct with where we want our camera to focus. So most cameras will allow you to move your autofocus point. It'll allow you to move it from side to side, top to bottom, so you can position your subject in one part of the frame and then just move the focus point over to focus on them. Personally, I like to keep my focus point in the middle at all times, and instead of moving my focus point to focus on them, what I'll do is I'll focus on them in the middle of my frame and then I'll reframe. So once the camera locks focus, I'll reframe and then take my shot. If you'd rather just move your focus point, you can do that. So you set your composition and then you move your focus point wherever on the screen you want your camera to focus. However, I just find that that really slows me down. I don't like to move my focus point around and make sure it's in the right place, because then if I want to recompose my focus point's in the wrong spot, I just think it slows me down too much. And that leads me on to point number 3, which is back button autofocus. So most of us, when we take pictures, we half press the shutter button, the camera will focus, we'll hear 2 beeps, and then when we fully press the shutter button, the camera will take the picture. Back button autofocus is when we separate the two. So we just use a button on the back of the camera to select focus, and the shutter button remains only for taking pictures. There's no focusing involved with the shutter button. So when I want to focus on something, I use my thumb, I find my subject, I focus with my thumb using back button autofocus, and then I take the picture with the shutter button. Why do I do this? Well, I do this because when I'm shooting with shutter autofocus enabled, so I half press the shutter button and the camera focused, every time I want to take a picture, I have to refocus, and it's so annoying, especially when you're shooting like portraits or something like that. You have to keep refocusing every single time, and I find that super, super annoying. With back button autofocus, I can get my focus, and then as long as I'm not adjusting my depth between me and the subject, the focus plane isn't gonna change. Nothing is gonna go out of focus. So the model can move around as long as they're on the same plane, and I can just keep snapping away photos and changing the composition. Like I said, as long as I'm not adjusting the depth, I don't have to refocus. And when you're using autofocus with your shutter button, you're refocusing on every shot, and I just think that's impractical. Moving on to point number 4, and that is your shutter speed is too slow. If you're using too slow of a shutter speed, your shots are gonna be blurry, and that's always gonna be the case. This is a super basic principle, and this might be already something that you know, but it's a mistake that I even make sometimes. Sometimes I'm shooting with a lens and I'm not paying attention to my camera settings, and my shutter speed dips a little bit too low, and then I go home to look at the photos and they're blurry. And it happens more often than I'd like to admit. The reason why your photos are gonna be blurry if your shutter speed gets too low is because our hands shake. You know, we aren't perfect tripods. Our hands are gonna move around, and that's gonna cause our images to be blurry if our shutter speed is too slow. Now, in terms of the exact shutter speed that you should use to make sure that you're not getting blurry photos from your hand shaking, that's gonna depend on what focal length you're shooting at. A good rule of thumb is to use the reciprocal of whatever focal length you're shooting at. So if you're shooting with a 50mm lens, you shouldn't go below 1/50th of a second for your shutter speed. If you're shooting with a 35mm lens, that'll be 1/35th of a second. And then if you're shooting with a 100mm lens, you shouldn't go below 1/100th of a second. So if you don't want to remember that, a good rule of thumb is just to not go below 1/60th of a second. And then if you're shooting with a longer lens, like a telephoto lens, just try not to go below 1/100th of a second, and you're probably going to be fine most of the time. Just know that when you're shooting at longer focal lengths, you should use a faster shutter speed because all of those micro jitters are really exemplified the further you are zoomed in. I found this out the hard way when I first got my new 70-200. I was shooting at 200mm and I was using like 1/50th of a second of a shutter speed. All my photos came out blurry. I was so disappointed, but I learned the hard way. So just make sure your shutter speed isn't too slow and your images are gonna be nice and crispy. Point number 5 is aperture. Aperture is super, super important for focus because aperture is what's gonna dictate your depth of field. If you're shooting at like f1.2 or f1.4, your depth of field is so incredibly shallow that you need to make sure that your focus point is right on target. If your focus point is a little bit off target, it can completely change the focus of your photo. Also, if you're shooting really close to something, say you're shooting macro photography or you're shooting food and you're getting pretty close to your subject and you're shooting at f1.4, f1.2, your depth of field is gonna be so shallow that most of the frame is gonna be out of focus, and it's actually not practical to use a super wide aperture in that situation. So what can you do? You can stop down to maybe f2.8, maybe f4 to make sure that you have more uniform focus throughout the frame. Aperture and depth of field is really gonna have a big impact on the focus of your images. So just pay close attention to the aperture that you're shooting at and ensure that it's the right aperture for capturing the focus that you want within your frame. And that leads me on to point number 6, which is know exactly where you wanna focus. Be deliberate with your focus point. One of the biggest mistakes I see with newer photographers is they go out, they start shooting, but they're not choosing their focus point and they're just letting the camera focus on whatever. They're just pointing their camera at something, focusing and taking a picture. But you should be very specific and deliberate with where you want your focus to be within your frame. For example, if you're shooting a portrait, you wanna make sure you're focusing in the eye. If you're focusing on the nose, that's not gonna look great, especially if you're shooting with an aperture of like f1.2. Their eyes are gonna be out of focus if you're shooting a portrait at f1.2 and you're focusing on their nose. And that's because the depth of field is gonna be so incredibly shallow at f1.2. If you're shooting food, be deliberate with which part of the food you want to be in focus. So if you're shooting a piece of cake, which part of the cake do you want to be in focus? If you're shooting a landscape, do you want the foreground to be in focus? Do you want the background to be in focus? So really be deliberate with where you're focusing within each image. That's really gonna play a big role in making sure that your images are sharp and that they look good. And lastly, you should know the minimum focusing distance of your lens. Not all lenses are able to get really close to the subject and still focus. Usually there's a gap. Maybe it's 6 inches, maybe it's 12 inches, maybe it's 2 feet, and your camera is just not going to focus on anything within that area. So you have to make sure you're standing a certain distance away from something before you can actually focus on it. Some lenses have really amazing minimum focusing distances and you can get really close to things and the lens will still focus on those things. Macro lenses often have really awesome minimum focusing distance, but most other lenses don't. So just make sure you're not getting too close to the subject because nothing is gonna be in focus if that's the case. But that's it guys, these are the tips I have for you to making sure that you get super sharp photos in every one of the images that you take. And I promise if you guys follow these tips, you're gonna get sharp photos. This is how I make sure that all my photos are sharp. And as long as I'm not making stupid decisions with shutter speed, like I told you with the 70-200, my images are gonna be sharp every single time. Anyways guys, I really hope you enjoyed this content. If you enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. We would love to have you here. And also don't forget to go to my website and download my free orange and teal preset pack. I think you guys will really like that. And I can't wait to hear what you guys think about it. But that's it from me guys. Thanks again for watching. I will see you very, very soon. And I hope you have an absolutely awesome day.